Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my May wrap up. So in May I read 8 books, which I was actually kind of surprised by at the end of the month that I had 8 books to talk about, because I feel like I barely read anything in May, and I felt like I was reading really slowly and I wasn't really getting through a lot of books. A good number of these are audiobooks, so that definitely helped, and I have some poetry books, so those went pretty quickly and stuff like that. But I think part of it is because in May I had my finals and everything for the semester, and I just was not reading as much during that time, but then I got a couple things read at the end of the month because I'm finally off of school for the summer. The first book that I read in May was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. This is a book that I feel like probably everybody knows because it was one of the most hyped books last year in 2018. It is a West African inspired YA fantasy. In this world there used to be magic users, but something occurred in their recent past actually that took magic away, and overall I enjoyed this book. There were some things about it that I thought weren't the greatest. I really didn't like the romance. That is one critique that before having read it, that was one of the most common things I would hear people talk about, was that they really didn't like the romance, the main romance that's in this book, and I definitely agree with that. I also felt like Anand's character, who is the prince perspective that we are following in this, his character has a change of heart way too quickly. I think he's supposed to have character development, but it didn't really feel like it developed. It felt like it was too much of flipping a switch kind of change, but then he would flip-flop back and forth, so I couldn't really tell if he was just an inconsistent character or he's just a very weak person who is not able to stick to a conviction, you know, and just that he does flip-flop. But so I just didn't like his character and the way that his character kind of interacted not only with the other characters but kind of with the story. But overall I did enjoy this. There were 3 main things that I really enjoyed. One was the friendship that develops between 2 female characters, just one of the characters in general, Amari. I think that her character development is really interesting and she becomes a really interesting character, and I liked her a lot. And then also one of the friendship that she is in with Zelly, I really liked their friendship and how it developed over time, because it started off with quite a bit of animosity between the 2 of them. So I really liked their friendship. I also really liked the setting. The setting is one of the things that really sets it apart, and it is a really interesting and rich setting that I really enjoyed reading about, that made the story so much more engaging. But the thing that I think I liked the most about this book was the way that it interwove a discussion of oppression into the storyline. I think that it did that very well and very seamlessly, and because of that I ended up rating this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Secret Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. This is a nonfiction book about trees and the way that they live and communicate, and it was really interesting. It was really cool to learn about all these details of the way that trees work, and just what their lives are like. The way that he talks about the trees is as if they're people. He talks about the way that they're feeling and then the way that they react to things, and kind of trees having family members or friends, and it's so fascinating, and it really makes you feel connected to trees, and that you could be friends with a tree, you know? And it was so much fun to read. There were a few parts that kind of dragged for me. There were times where I felt like the information got a little bit repetitive, but overall I had a really good time reading this. Also, the narrator for this I really enjoyed because his voice sounded like a nature documentary, which this essentially is a book form of a nature documentary, and I love nature documentaries, and so it was just so fun and so soothing to just listen to his voice talking about trees. and I gave The Hidden Life of Trees like 3.75 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Coldest Girl in Coldtown by Holly Black, and this is a standalone contemporary like fantasy, urban fantasy maybe, that is about vampires. And in this like version of our world, there has been an outbreak of vampires, and vampires, like everyone knows that vampires exist, but they're supposed to be contained in what they call cold towns, so they're kind of quarantined. And our story starts with the main character waking up at a party where she had passed out the night before and realizes that while she was unconscious, the party had been attacked by vampires. And she believes that she may have been infected, a friend of hers may have been infected, and so they start to travel to the nearest cold town where they can be quarantined until it is determined whether they are going to become vampires or not. And so part of the story is kind of their journey to the cold town, and then part of it is once they're at the cold town, kind of what happens and how they deal with it. And this book was like just okay to me. I have been really enjoying listening to a lot of Holly Black's books, but this is probably one of my least favorite ones that I've listened to, but I feel like a lot of that is just because I don't like vampires that much, and it was fine, but I think that it definitely for me was just like tainted by the fact that I don't like vampires. So I don't know if I'm a really good judge as to whether this is actually a good book or not, because like I just don't like vampires, so I don't think this was going to be a win for me no matter what. Although one thing I do want to say about it is that I think the romance that's in it like just came out of nowhere. Like it was something that I definitely expected it to happen. I knew it was gonna happen, but there wasn't really any build-up or development in the story that would make it make sense. And then at the end, it just like bam, came out of nowhere, and I was like, what just happened? So I gave The Coldest Girl in Coldtown 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Inward by Young Pueblo. This is a book of poetry. This is one I was actually like super excited about, and I buddy read this with my friend Kathleen, and this is a book of poetry that is supposed to be all about contemplation, meditation, introspection, all of that kind of stuff, which are all things that I love. Like I love like introspection and contemplation, like one of my favorite things. So I was super excited for this poetry book. Unfortunately, it didn't really like live up to my expectations. As I was reading this, something that actually Kathleen and I both felt while we were reading this was that we weren't disagreeing with anything that he was saying in this, but it also didn't really like resonate that much, and kind of had this experience of reading it and being like, yes, true, agreed, but not really having that like emotive kind of like resonance with it that I usually would think of when I find poetry that I like, and that you kind of like, you feel it, and you feel a connection to it or something. And I think that part of why I felt that way is because it really lacks in like imagery and metaphor and personal connection. So he doesn't really use a lot of imagery or metaphor in this. It is written very like plain and straightforward, which I tend to like more imagery and metaphor in poetry. That is what I find more evocative in poetry and I connect to more. But it also was definitely lacking in like a personal touch to it. So it often would feel kind of preachy and like it was trying to give you advice instead of speaking of a personal experience. And I think I tend to connect more to poetry that is someone speaking from their own experience and talking about like, this is what I experienced and maybe this is what I've learned from it, instead of saying, this is what you should do or what you should know or you should learn. I also just like didn't really like that a lot of the poems focused very heavily on the concept of calm, and like that it felt like he was kind of saying that being calm was like the ultimate good or the ultimate goal, which I don't agree with. I don't think that calmness is really the goal. But then he also used the words calm and peace as if, like, interchangeably, as if they're the same thing, which they're not, because I would agree with somebody if they say that peace is like the goal, but I would not agree with calm being the goal, because I think that peace allows for more variability than calm does. So that was something that was like a pet peeve that was just like annoying me through a lot of his poems. So I think that he and I are maybe just coming from slightly different perspectives and have slightly different philosophies when it comes to both like introspection and kind of what is the purpose of meditation. But there were a few poems and quotes that I enjoyed from this. Overall, I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Beast Player by Naoko Uehashi. This is one that I recently hauled and I was super excited about, so I wanted to get to it right away. Our main character, Ellen's mother, is a beast steward, and so that means that she takes care of the magical beasts that are used by the military. So they have these like kind of sea serpent type creatures. Some of those animals die and the mother is blamed for it and killed, and that then kind of sets our Ellen off on a journey because she can no longer stay in the community that she had been living in before. And from there she has a few different transitions throughout her life, and she learns that she has the ability to communicate with magical beasts as well and understand them on a deeper level than most other people can. And then that gets her very wrapped up in some political scheming that is going on in this world. So this one, as I said, I was extremely excited for. It didn't quite live up to my expectations. I did enjoy this book. I think that one of the things that I heard a lot about this book was that the world was very rich and beautiful, and the description of like the natural world was so beautifully done, and I definitely agree with that. I think that the world is beautifully described. It is a very rich world, both in the description of the natural world and also in the like mythology of this world. This book also had a very distinct feeling to it while I was reading it, and the descriptions of the magical beasts were very visceral. Like there are some of them that they describe the scent of some of the beasts a lot, and I would feel like I could like smell them, you know? I would feel like I was there. So I think that is very well done. But the things that I had difficulty with this were, one, I felt like we didn't know enough about the characters to really be attached to them or really feel connected to the characters. But also I think that this story tried to be too big, and that it just like couldn't support how large it was trying to be. This is a pretty short book. It's like 350 pages, and it tried to become a very like large political fantasy that I don't think it was able to support. I would have liked if it stayed as a smaller story that was more about like the natural world, these magical creatures, her personal power, and also maybe discovering more about like her mother's people, because her mother comes from a group of people who had these kind of like magical abilities, but she is estranged from that side of the family. And so I thought it would have been really interesting if she had gone to and learned more about them and their abilities and everything, like, and their history and everything. There was a large portion of this book that was just about like beekeeping, because she gets taken in at one point by a beekeeper, and really that was my favorite part of the book. Like it was just her like running through the fields, looking at the wildflowers, like watching the bees, talking about bees, learning how to be a beekeeper, and like I was totally on board for it. Because it was written so beautifully, the description of the natural world was so well done that like I was totally on board for this book just being about beekeeping. I would have been like, yes, beekeeping, let's go, I want to hear all about it. Like I was totally for that. but then it moved on from that and tried to become this like larger political fantasy, and I just don't think that it was able to do that effectively. So while the world felt very rich, the story felt very sparse. So I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab, which is the first book in her new middle grade series that came out last year. And I decided to read this one now, actually, because it took me a long time to get through The Beast Player, even though it's a pretty short book, and I just wanted something that I could fly through really quickly, and I definitely did that with this because I read almost all of it in one day. I definitely finished it in under 24 hours. I read almost the whole thing in one day, and then like the next day I woke up early and just like read the last couple chapters, and I would have finished it in one day, except I got distracted by my dogs. But this follows Cass, who is able to see ghosts and is able to pass back and forth between our world and the spirit world. She has a ghost best friend also, and her parents are ghost hunters. So they write books about ghosts, but then they decide that they're going to start a TV show, and for that they have to go on location to go ghost hunting. And so Cass goes with them in this. They end up in Edinburgh to visit some ghosty sites, and Cass finds out that there are some real ghosts, and there is one ghost that is like the big baddie in the area, who is kind of like almost a Pied Piper kind of character, that she steals children. And Cass also finds someone else who is also able to see ghosts, and so this is the first time she has found that anybody else has the same ability. So Cass and her ghost best friend and this other person who's also able to see ghosts team up to save themselves from this like Pied Piper, like big baddie kind of ghost. And this one was really fun. It was a really fast read, so it was very easy to fly through. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this one. I probably will read the next one, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Waking Land by Callie Bates. This is actually one that I've been wanting to read for a long time, but I specifically wanted an audiobook, so I finally got a hold of an audiobook of it. And this follows our main character, Ilana, who has been raised as a political prisoner, essentially. And so she has been raised by her parents' enemy, but she has kind of been raised to believe that he was correct and that her parents were in the wrong. But her parents are trying to have another revolution. They have a new prince that they want to put on the throne, and they want to get her back. Because she also has special powers that they need for their revolution, because she is what they call the steward of the land, which means that she has a special magical connection to the land and can communicate with it and the spirits of the land. So as I said, this is one I've been wanting to read for a long time because it is supposed to have like very strong like nature vibes to it. And I definitely think that was one of the best parts of it, when it really got into those like descriptors of her being like connected to the land. That was probably my favorite part of it, so definitely got that part. Overall, I enjoyed it. I don't have a lot to say about it because there wasn't anything that like really stood out to me as especially good or bad, other than like the nature magic aspect to it. I don't think I'm going to be continuing the series because I know there's at least a second book, if not a third book in the series, but I don't think I'm going to be reading those. Glad I finally got to read this one, but I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in May was Fierce Fairy Tales by Nikita Gill. This is another book of poetry, but it's sort of like retellings or putting a new spin on fairy tales. So what she'll do is kind of tell part of a fairy tale. They're never more than like 3 pages at most, and sometimes she'll give either backstory to a villain, or she will kind of draw a new lesson or new moral of the story from a fairy tale. Sometimes she will connect an experience from a fairy tale to like a something more modern, or she'll make a connection between a fairy tale and something like trauma or depression or some other experience like that. And I really enjoyed this book. I like Nikita Gill's poetry a lot. I have read one other book of poetry by her, which I also really liked. And I liked seeing kind of these new like twists on like what is the moral of the story for each of these fairy tales. I also thought the ones that were giving backstory to the villains were especially interesting, and I just thought this was really well done. I really enjoyed it, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So those are all of the books that I read in May. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!